Okay, welcome very much to Conversations. It's a pleasure to welcome to the program a friend of Conversations and the world, and a person who's appeared often in this series, and that's Robert Ashford. And Robert Ashford is here in New York in early January of 2008, bringing in the new year on a good note, one might say, having attended a conference of law professors that was held at the Hilton Hotel and came off very successfully. And he's the law professor at Syracuse College of Law, and he's also the co-author of a major work called Binary Economics, The New Paradigm, no stranger to viewers of Conversations. Bob, welcome really very much to Conversations in our mini studio.
Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here.
So good to see you. We taped the program with you a few months ago, and put it on here in the same studio. We're able to do it again, and welcome to 2008 and to the Conversation series. And if I may, congratulations on a very successful conference. I think you must agree that that was the case. I was there, attended. I was very pleased. We had luminaries like Representative Conyers from Detroit, Judiciary Chairman and that sort of thing, and others, Professor Bell and other leading figures. It was very successful. But maybe you could, we'll talk about that, about the conference and about that, but maybe you could share, for people who've not seen previous programs, your own background a little bit, okay? Sure. And then we'll go into some of the precepts of this paradigm, binary economics, that you're one of the major carriers of. And we'll talk about that and other matters, but welcome very much to Conversations.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm a law teacher. I teach law at Syracuse University. Before going to law school, I majored in physics and English, double major, the left side and the right side of the brain. But I've always had a deep concern about the economically disadvantaged people. I'm always very painfully aware that even now, from the time that this program started until now, numbers of people have died for lack of food, some lack of clothing, lack of resources, lack of medical care. Just as two people speak as they meet in the hall, there's death all over the world unnecessarily. And it's ironic.
Unnecessarily?
I think unnecessarily, because I think we have the capacity to produce enough for the needs of everybody. We have that technological capacity.
That's a very important concept, no?
Yes, I think it is.
Yeah.
And we don't, but the economy, the economic system isn't wired to bring these benefits to people profitably.
Okay.
And I think that's a real problem. This is really the question that Adam Smith was considering way back in 1776 when he was looking at the question of why did some nations accumulate wealth, which is the result of productive capacity, and other nations did not. And he was trying to study that question.
He began modern economics.
And he really did. He founded that. And the interesting thing is that since 1776, if you look at the world of science, which actually has solved the production problems in the physical sense, since 1776 we've had 10, 12, 14 scientific revolutions, and the physical world has not changed. But we've had major ways of looking at the world in a new way. But since 1776, although the way we produce goods and services has dramatically changed, become much more capital intensive and grown, we haven't fundamentally changed the way we look at the physical world, the economic world, since Adam Smith. We still have this notion that the non-human factors of production, which we call capital, have substantially grown in the capacity of technology to produce more. We have far more capital-intensive production than in 1776, but we haven't stopped looking at the way the world has changed.
I wonder if we could talk about that a little bit, if you don't mind. The idea of capital and the idea of a capitalist order and so forth, it might be some confusion in people's mind. If you say capital, or you're talking about technology or everything other than human labor.
Yeah,
what we're talking about. Yes. But to call it capital, is it appropriate to say capital, or would you say everything else or something? Because there are other factors that are part of that. I'm just trying to get at something here.
Sure.
That
well, we don't write on a clean slate. So to the extent that you can use the terms that had been used now. it's helpful to do that. Now Adam Smith
Uh-huh.
saw three factors of production, really. He saw the human labor, which he saw as the fundamental source of production. He saw land, and he saw what he considered to be human-made capital. Like, he didn't see many machinery, but tools, structures, things of that sort.
He talked about stock, too, didn't he?
Capital stock.
Yeah.
Stock was the
Capital
supply
stock, right.
of capital. So he saw three. The binary economist, because looking at these things, we tend to divide it simply into the human and the non-human. And that which is productive but not human, we call capital. We merge the land. Land is productive. Trees are productive. We see tools. Horses are productive. The beasts of burden are productive. We see tools as being productive.
Right.
So it's the human and the non-human. Now there's another term of capital which can confuse people, and that is the issue called financial capital.
Right. Make the distinction.
Well, the distinction between financial capital and real capital, what Smith called capital, is really basic. The real capital are the things that you can employ in production. Trees, for example, produce apples. Horses haul sacks. Land is the substance from which plants grow their roots and produce things. That's real capital. Financial capital is a claim on real capital. It's the property system that determines who owns what. Now, if you look at it from an accounting point of view, financial capital and real capital they're really kind of opposites. If I were to draw a balance sheet, balance sheet basically is like a T. It looks like this.
Yeah.
And what's on the left-hand side of the balance sheet, as the viewer looks at it, these are the real assets. These are land, machines, tools, structures. That's on the left hand, and you list them. On the right-hand side of the balance sheet is what we call the financial capital. That's the claim on the real capital. The first claim on real capital in a corporation or a partnership are what we call the trade creditors, the people that you owe money to because you may have borrowed, or an employee may have done a day's work and you owe him wages. That's the top side of the right hand. And then below that is what they call the equity capital. That takes after capital stock, bonds and stock. So if a bank loans money, then there'd be a bank loan on the right-hand side, and the cash would be listed on the left. But cash is just a transitory thing. Typically, you don't keep too much cash. You turn it into some productive tool or another. Cash itself, money itself, is not productive. It doesn't make anything. It doesn't haul the way a horse hauls.
Right.
It doesn't produce fruit the way a tree does. You can turn it into a horse by buying a horse. You can convert it into a tree. You can convert it into land.
Monetize it.
Yeah, you can exchange it.
Yeah. Okay.
But it itself doesn't produce anything. And the ownership claim, the bonds or the stock that's on this right-hand side, having a claim on the assets, they don't really produce anything. They're a claim on what is producing. And there are two basic producers. There is the human producer in terms of labor, human beings working.
And everybody owns their own labor unless we have chattel slavery.
Unless you're a slave, that's right. And then there's the capital side of it. And capital is land, machines, tools, and structures. And the key to understanding how Adam Smith looked at it on the one hand, and most economists, and how the binary economist looks at it, is that Smith thought the role of capital was to make labor more productive.
Most all of your economic theory, I want to suggest, I want you to go with it, but it's all predicated essentially in terms of a theoretical basis upon a labor theory of value. It seems to me,
the idea
you can set me
labor
straight,
does the work.
with the possible exception of the binary paradigm.
That's right.
That sets it aside.
It does.
Okay,
and
that's a large claim.
Sure. And the difference is because, remember, Adam Smith was trying to explain the growth. So let's take an example of growth. Let's suppose you can saw 10 boards an hour with a handsaw. and 100 boards an hour with a machine saw.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, and we went from hand saws to machine saws. We went from hand shovels to steam saws. We went from all sorts of hand tools to the machine tools.
That's right.
And there was this sort of growth that comes. So he saw capital makes labor more productive.
Right.
It focuses on the human part.
Yeah.
Well, the binary economist says, yes, there's always a human part, but there's a more important way of looking at the entire process. And that is not by the example of the hand saw to the machine saw, but another thing. Let's suppose you haul a sack, heavy sack, a mile, and you're exhausted. But you can put 10 sacks on a horse, and leading the horse go twice as far in half the time, you're actually doing less work, and the horse is doing really doing all the extra work. So the binary economist sees growth as the function is shifting work from the human to the non-human.
In a sense, the technological revolutions that are going on with great alarming regularity in many people's mind now are on the upswing through history.
Yes.
And in an almost exponential way now. And the traditional way of dealing with things in terms of economics and national policy and the political process that is informed by economic theory has not adequately, in your mind, my mind, and a few others, has not adequately kept track of this fundamental paradigm shift in the basis by which economic theory can relate to the real world.
The horse is doing something much more important than just making the person more productive. The horse is doing most of the extra work. And we don't distinguish between a horse doing extra work or a truck. You could put 10,000 sacks on a truck.
Or a locomotive.
Or a locomotive. Or a steamship. Or an airplane. So we don't make the distinction. So when the man or the woman saws 10 boards an hour by hand and 100 boards an hour with the machine saw, we see the machine is doing most of the extra work. Now, it is true that it takes the person to run the hand saw or the machine saw.
Has to push the button to start it anyway, yeah.
But the work of pushing the button is not the work that's done by the machine saw. That's worrying that electrical energy.
Right.
Now, some people say, but it takes the person to lead the horse. The horse wouldn't know where to go. And I say, fine, but the work of leading is not the work of hauling.
Right, and also the input is changed fundamentally through time, through technology. I know you have a couple of charts we're going to try and show on this program and so forth, but this might be a time we could introduce one that your mentor, Louis Kelso, had brought out that tries to deal with this issue. And I wonder if we could go to the computer and show a chart and see if it doesn't come up. Go ahead. Let's go there now, if you would. Okay, there. We can see it. You could turn your head, Bob, and see this is the changing participation of labor workers, and then he called them capital workers in production of goods and services in the United States economy through time from 1776 at the far left of the screen to the present, or a projection. Maybe you could describe or talk to this chart a little bit for the audience.
That's a visual depiction.
Yes.
It's supposed to give you the general idea. These actual percentages are just for the purpose of... But what it shows is that you notice that the graph starts very low. So his idea was in 1776, when you look at all the things that were done, just a little bit of capital input. That's the bottom line there, from the bottom of the graph to that beginning curving line.
And if I may,
and the top, going from the top really starting with that curvy line, and going all the way up to the top of the picture. That's mostly labor input.
That's labor
input.
So
so over time, you see capital input growing, and labor input relatively decreasing.
Right.
Now that's a percentage chart.
Yes.
And he's talking about, maybe his estimate there was maybe starting about 10% capital input, and maybe 85% or maybe 15%, and 85% labor input, but growing to where he thought maybe it's about 90% capital input. And 10% labor. Now, the critical percentages aren't important.
No, but
it's important, the shape.
The trend. And in a paradigm sense, the fact that, you had all those forests and you had a hatchet. Right. You were a far, far cry from the technology that was to come.
You can flatten
that
the
made
whole...
possible.
That's right. You can now do massive numbers of tree cuttings.
Right, and that they shifted fundamentally from, he's making that suggestion. People could take others, and people measure these things. And that's in a certain sense is there, and that's something that's very important and seems to go unnoticed because we still have the theories by which our system is organized, economic system, political system, distribution of income and so forth is all predicated on this labor theory of value.
The idea
it
that
had great
labor
relevance in 1776, but its relevance in terms of a reality base and a thing by which the reality could informing the political reality is shifted fundamentally, and our thinking has not.
That's right. And basically what I think Louis Kelso's vision does is capture the essence of what it means to be human as a tool maker from the very beginning. We have been shifting work from the human to the non-human from the time the first early hominids began using tools.
I believe that's true, don't you?
And I believe it's true.
Yeah.
So there's that. And as you say, it has an increasing impact. Now, one of the things I like to do at this point is that once you conceive that capital is an independent producer, then you actually come to focus on something that economists tend to miss, and that is that capital actually contributes to growth in 6 fundamental ways.
Okay.
Now, to look at.
Now, there's 2 things that we could be dealing with, perhaps at a political. We're just in a political season. Mr. Obama just won a big election, saying we need big change out in Iowa. He may be on a big roll. There may be something. There's something blowing in the wind. Bobby Dylan told us from the arts realm and everything, presaging a liberating or a major transformation in the way we see things, and that's maybe something worth having in mind as you go on with your dissertation.
Sure. Well, let's look at the ways that capital contributes to growth.
Capital and technology, maybe, or
well, it's interesting. Technology is a fuzzy word.
Yeah,
and you got to look at that word and notice that there's 2 impacts. One aspect of technology is simply human understanding. I mean, I can say I understand that by loading a horse on a sack on a horse, I can get it to do work that I wasn't able to do. That you can say is a technology. It's an understanding. But it takes the actual loading the sack on the horse and getting the horse to do the work, and the idea doesn't do the work.
Right.
But implementing the idea creates each instantiation.
Instantiates a term that's going to be
that thing. So for example, the idea
Go ahead.
that we can set up a wheel rather than drag something along the ground. The idea of a wheel is one thing, but it's all the work that wheels do. Wheels over all these years is the work of the wheel itself. The concept you can say is technology, but technology is reflected either in a change in the way humans do work or a change in the way things that we employ do work.
Right.
And that's where the growth comes in.
And we've been here, apparently they tell us, I have a large view of things, interested in all kinds of things and everything, but apparently from the mitochondrial DNA, from biology, and linguistic overlay and so forth, in the evolutionary process, 4 million years ago, we were contained within what was an Australopithecine. Homo habilis was to come, and 200,000 years ago we appeared, that person who was able to make tools. There were people making tools before that, but Homo sapiens sapien, our species, appeared. We've been there. And we had very little capability to do other than to gather what was around us and so forth. But being able to build a house is different than coming upon a cave that has been provided by the environment out of which one is coming.
Correct.
And that's the difference. And using the tool making, and it's been a long grinding road up Mount Sisyphus, some people call it, the human condition. And during all of that time, you began this little essay with your saying you're very concerned that every day there is something that could be benefiting the human society, and increasingly that's also the ecology, that is not being done because of ill-conceived notions of economics and so forth, which motivate you and your thing. That's been the condition throughout the human experience, has it not? That we've had a capability.
We are growing capability.
Well, the term you use, unutilized capability or
productive capacity, which is either
you say
used
productive capacity, capability is more or less, they're more or less similar, no?
Simple.
And it's been there throughout the human experience in a certain sense.
It's been growing.
It's been growing in terms of our technologically augmented capability to provide life support even within an ecological context and provide growth and so forth. And now it's growing in very, very rapid dimension in terms of the time in which you and I sit and talk now.
But our ability to profitably employ it seems to be bottlenecked, and that's the issue. That's the part of the issue. But just to consider, just for a moment, the power of capital, and then you can begin talking about how you can...
One thing, if I may,
how
Bob,
you can employ it.
One thing, if I may. You use the term, and it's a strong term, and it's one that you said, talking about finance capital and so forth. Capital is a loaded word in people's minds and so forth. And so you want to, again, to re-undercut or reify, or it's good you use that term instantiate. I think that's going to become very important, particularly in the realm of cyber and so forth. But the term capital has a certain connotation for a lot of people.
Yes. For some people it's a dirty word.
For a lot of people in the world, it's associated with robber capitalism, baron and that sort of thing. So is it important to call it capital when you're referring to everything else other than human labor? Or
well, again,
is there a term that would be better, like Lewis called it, capital workers, they referred to the technology or something. Maybe that's because they're trying, all of our systems are geared toward reifying labor theory of value. And the binary is apart from that. But to call it capital, technology exists apart from the capital. And that distinction, I think, is an important one to try and draw, or do you not think that?
Well, I
think...
Just
if only for political or realistically being able to be understood by the populace.
Well, again, there's a lot of confusion about these words and a lot of loaded aspects. I think Louis Kelso used the word capital worker because he wanted to emphasize that capital does work in the same sense that labor does work.
Thank you. That's a very important concept, is it not?
And that's why he used the word capital worker, because if you want a sack, or if you want 10 sacks hauled from point A to point B,
or what's in the sacks,
then you don't really care, it seems to me.
In
fact, you'd rather have it done in the way that causes less human effort.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, unless your object is, is bodybuilding. Or
yes, right.
So, which is true.
Really true. Or they think there's a great value in just building unneeded capacity or unwanted or unavailable capacity. I mean, they could do that if they wanted to.
But if you want to fast forward the problem here, that is to say, we have a problem in distributing income. We have welfare because people don't earn enough. We have labor unions to bid up the labor because people can't on their own bargain for a living wage. So we have minimum wage laws. We're looking for ways to enhance earning capacity. And Louis Kelso would say, and I would say also, that as production becomes more capital intensive, then capital has to be increasingly the direct source of distribution. Capital income needs to be distributed to the people that we expect to purchase what capital is increasingly producing.
Capital, again, I don't mean to be, but if you had a pure socialist state and you didn't have capital in the sense of finance capital, like you said and so forth, the technology could still be there. And there's many people you talk to, say from a left-wing perspective, they want to reify the notion of the human input to labor. I mean, labor's human input to production, because realize that throughout, all 200,000 years of human existence, right up to the present, people get their sense of identity by their contribution to production, and they say that the labor built the machine. So you had to have the labor to build the machine. And I think the Marxists, it might be worth talking to some of our leftist brethren, it's surplus value of labor and it's all predicated upon a labor theory of value, and you want to bring that into a question. But this is not something that's related only to the finance capital people or the well-to-do or anything of that sort of thing. This is something that could be inclusive of what the so-called progressive community, if they don't get hung up over this use of the term capital. It's actually technology and the productive capital without being taking into account, but not being hypnotized by some of the claims of the finance capital world presently constructed.
Well, I think it's important to develop accurate understandings of what is going on.
Thank you. That's very important.
And I think it is important for people who have misconceptions or charged conceptions to say, what's more important, to cling on to my old perception?
There's a lot of turf to be
or
protected.
Is it more important to clearly understand what's going on? Now it was Karl Marx who invented the term capitalism.
Okay.
So he
let's
saw
address that. And because we're in public access, most of the people who are viewing are going to be on the progressive side, who view YouTube and so forth.
Sure.
It might be, this has relevance to them, and perhaps them finding Mr. Obama just got elected. They're talking about a major change. Progressives want to see human justice. They want it on that side. And they have been, in a certain sense, in the mind of many, blinkered by their commitment to this labor theory of value that was championed, in many people's mind, by the surplus value of labor, notions that Karl Marx advanced. But how do we address the left-wing progressive, so-called progressive
I think
communities?
it would be helpful to tell the left wing what we ought to tell the right wing and the center, and that is, it'd be nice if you would open your mind.
Yes, thank you. That
is to say, to look at something in another way. Well, you know, I do come at this as a lawyer, and for some people that in and of itself to be seen as a sin. But one of the wonderful things about the American legal system and the English legal system, it's what they call the adversary system.
Yeah.
One of the good, there has some faults, but one of the good things about it is that it assumes that there's always another way of looking at something.
Right, it's part of the scientific...
It's an open-minded notion.
Sort of
there's always another way, and it may be that other way of looking at something, although it may seem hostile or antagonistic to you initially.
It's very likely to initially,
It may be very liberating.
Yeah, that's right.
So let's
with new big ideas.
So let's talk about two things. Let's talk about two things that I think would be important to somebody who's concerned about poor and working people and their welfare.
Right,
Let's talk, and I very much.
That's where your major concern is.
That's where my heart is.
Okay.
Let's talk about two things that maybe should be important to people who are concerned about poor and working people. One is rights, and one is power.
Okay.
Rights and power.
People power.
Rights and power.
Right. Okay.
And so I would say that first of all, looking at it from the point of view of power for a minute, economic power is a very important thing.
Yeah.
Now, what do we mean by economic power? There are various notions of economic power, but I would say a very simple definition of economic power is the power to produce goods and services.
Okay.
The power to produce goods and services.
Distinguish that from political power, the ability to make laws and set up a system and martial armies and that kind of thing.
Well, the political power is the power to make laws, to make regulations, judges that make judgments about things. You could call that the exercise of political power, though it's supposed to be judicial in nature. But the legal side is that. The command side, I mean, there's military power.
Yes, indeed.
There's physical power.
Iraq,
but let's just look
Vietnam.
for a minute. And there are those that say political power controls economic power. But let's just look
and if I may, Lord Acton did say power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
So democracy should be interested in diffusing power.
Absolutely.
And that individual participation in power, the individual participating in power, is the ideal. At least if you believe in democracy. Now, so let's look at economic power.
Okay.
Now, just forget it and step aside for a minute from the political connection.
Okay.
A person has the economic power to haul a sack.
Right. They have their labor power.
They have the power to haul. A horse has much more power to haul a sack,
Particularly a draft horse.
than an individual.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And a truck has even much more power to haul. Now, it's through ownership of either the horse or the truck that the individual is empowered not only by his labor, but by the thing he owns. So to enhance economic power, one way that is done is by expanding ownership.
Okay, ownership, okay.
The owner of the horse, I mean, we could have a system that gave horses economic rights.
Well, I think there are going to be a lot of people on the animal rights thing you're going to run into, because it's beginning to meld down. And we're becoming more aware that it's not only human rights, it's also animal or ecological rights within biodiversity requirements of a maximally engaged system that takes into larger context.
Well, there are many things we can do. We can't really tackle all problems and satisfy all people all at once, but we can't. But we can look at the question of how to empower people,
and also the trends.
And so one way to empower people is to enable them to own. So that's so there's a look. There's a term.
Now could they again, trying to talk to a progressive people, they could own that collectively through the political process.
But if you own something collectively, then you need to have to agree with other people.
Right.
One of the nice things about owning a horse individually is you don't have to have a decision made by a committee. That is to say, if you believe in autonomy to any extent, individual freedom, then the scope of what you own individually empowers you.
Okay.
Now, so that's one proposition. Now, then we look at the issue of the interesting thing about the capital and power is that if you examine this process that we saw on the board, where capital is doing most of the work, we've evolved to the point today where capital is such a powerful producer that almost all capital is acquired, almost all additional capital is acquired with the earnings of capital.
Could you say that again?
Almost all capital is acquired with the earnings of capital.
Could you spell it out? Because it's a very important concept for people to get into their minds. And also, Lord Keynes, if I may, I didn't get into economic theory, had that letter to his grandchildren written in 1930 about now it comes, and it says, we are going to be confronted with technologically induced, automated, technological displacement of labor in the productive process.
And again, that's what's shown in that chart that Louis Kelso showed. But you see, we've skipped over something, and it's hard to give the viewer every aspect at once. I was way back in the beginning of our discussion, and I tried to explain what the powers of capital are. And so to understand this issue of power and rights, it helps to know that capital replaces labor. And when you replace labor with capital, you get leisure. Because now you can have the capital do the work, and you can put your feet up and relax. You may have to do some leading or button pushing, but you're doing a lot less work. Now the second thing capital does is not only does capital replace labor, that's kind of a misnomer. Actually, anytime you use a capital instrument, which is much more potent than labor.
A capital instrument?
Yes, a capital instrument.
What would that mean?
Well, a horse is a capital instrument. A truck is a capital instrument.
A piece of corporate stock?
That's not a capital. That's a claim on the ownership.
An important distinction.
Yeah, claim. We talked about that.
So,
so capital not only replaces labor. When you substitute a piece of capital for what was done by labor, you typically get vastly more productive power. We can't compete with horses or trucks for hauling. We can't compete with calculators for calculating. You can't compete with all of these things.
No human being could make a microchip.
That's right. Well, that's the third. Now, that's the third element. That's you've gone into the third thing that capital can do is that capital can do work that labor alone can never do, and this is obscured when you think of the idea of capital simply increasing labor productivity. For example, I always say
the labor gets in the way.
Well, the labor can't do certain things.
Yeah, absolutely.
A farmer never grew an apple, folks. Only a tree can grow an apple.
That's right.
A farmer cannot grow an apple.
Right.
We marvel at the computer revolution, but Harold, as you've indicated, we can't make a single computer chip because our hands are too big.
Yeah.
We can't saw a board. We've been talking about sawing boards, but the truth is we can't saw a single board. Couldn't put a single nail in a board without a hammer. So capital does work that labor can never, ever, ever do. Mm-hmm. And so that shows you, for example, that those people say, well, I mean, and typically it's the capitalists that want to own everything that say this. Mm-hmm. They say, well, capital creates many more jobs for labor. Mm-hmm. But the truth is capital creates many, 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 many more jobs for capital. Mm-hmm. Far more capital creates far more jobs for capital than it does for labor.
Capital. That's an unusual term in a certain sense, because when you say jobs for capital, it may be worth underscoring for the audience.
Again, the capital is a worker.
Yeah,
if you want to pound a nail, it's a job for a hammer. If you want to saw a board, it's a job for a saw. If you want to grow an apple, it's a job for a tree. You can help these things.
Yeah, right.
But when you look at it holistically, so capital does work that labor can never do. Capital does work without labor. I always tell people, folks, if you don't think capital does its own work, then try living without your washing machine. Mm-hmm. So capital has this power. Mm-hmm. And if you look to do these things, and if you look at this massive power, mm-hmm. it is doing all these things. And the truth is that almost all capital today in America is acquired not with the earnings of labor, but with the earnings of capital. Okay. So, and when I say almost that, I'm making a bit of a leap here. I'm going to say that when you hire a lawyer, the last thing you want the lawyer to do is spend, because you're paying them by the hour usually, is to fiddle around with the small change stuff.
Right.
You want them to get to the big stuff.
Right.
All right. In America, the largest 3,000 corporations own easily 90% of the investable capital.
Okay, that's making the link between the actual technology and things that are other than labor and the finance world, and that's where you're dealing with it in economic theory. Yeah,
that's right.
Okay.
So capital, the largest 3,000 corporations own most of the capital, and every year they acquire more capital, and they don't acquire capital with the earnings of labor. Mm-hmm. They acquire capital with the earnings. That is, you pay the laborers, mm-hmm. but after the end of that day, after you paid the laborers, there's profits mm-hmm. that are the result of the work of capital.
Of the expanding work of the capital instruments that present.
Now the Marxist wants to say that's surplus labor. Yeah. But when the horse does the hauling, there's no surplus labor in that. Mm-hmm. That's the work of the horse. Mm-hmm. And when you look at things with a rational and clear look, mm-hmm. Horses, trucks, if you look at that sort of notion, hand saws, machine saws, all the tools we use now we didn't before, it's not surplus labor. Mm-hmm. It's capital doing the work. Now, it may have taken labor to build it.
Yeah, that's a point often they'll bring up. And also history involves a national policy in terms of, we talk about political, Obama, whatever going on, okay? The history, it is, but it's still true that in terms of, let's say, the United States economy, the United States polity, that the basic policy grounding state, we have a Federal Communications Act of 1934, that's communications, there's different things. But in terms of economic, the grounding policy statement of the United States is still the Employment Act of 1946, which states that distribution of income will be done through the mass participation by the people in their labor earning capability as wage workers. Yes, and that's the way we'll distribute income to them. They will not have any ownership of the capital instruments that are creating wealth. It's not a goal, and there's no reason we can distribute everything by creating jobs.
Jobs and welfare. That's the policy.
And Mr. Keynes said we're going to be running into a buzzsaw because the technology is going to be so displacing of the labor input. So we're up against a very real conundrum in terms of the reality and the historically inherited institutions.
Now, the reaction against capital buying itself with the earnings of capital, and the reaction against considering
it's all a few people
considering that that wanting to look at it as though it's surplus labor, is the fact that right now capital is only acquired by existing owners.
Yeah, right.
But the other element, and we've only talked about, in a sense, the one side of the binary theory, mm-hmm. What is truly new about binary economics, what is truly new, besides the idea that capital does its own work, mm-hmm. is the idea that the more broadly capital is acquired with the earnings of capital, that is to say, the more broadly the distribution of ownership is expanded by enabling people to acquire capital with the earnings of capital, the more we will soak up unused capacity, and the more we will promote growth. That is the essence of the binary theory of economic growth. The more broadly, so the capital that now buys itself for the rich and leaves jobs and welfare for everybody else could buy itself even more profitably if poor and working people are cut into the process.
It would create, if I may, we have a lot of arguments go on at the theoretical level, and it's economics that informs the political process.
Yes.
We have a lot of argument, and it comes down to supply side, Mundell, those people, and the demand side, Keynes, and that kind of thing. And Louis Kelso, if I'm not mistaken, used to talk about simulfinancing. He used the term simulfinance, where you're financing the capital requirement for capital accumulation
and the earning capacity to buy it.
And the distribution of income to buy what is able to be produced being done simultaneously instead of it being a zero sum, either supply side or demand side, which they keep arguing about Democrat and Republican and so forth. Simulfinancing is what we need to get the real exponential growth that might be the promise.
Now there is a lag.
And the requirement. And the lag is the time in which it takes to pay back the purchase price of the stock that represents the technology, right?
There is a lag, but it's not a huge lag.
How long is it? What is the payback period?
3, 5, 7 years.
Wait a minute. Spell it out, would you, Bob? It's an important concept. So that the ability for people to begin to get income, let's say the folks, rather than just the capital finance people.
Well, 3 to 7 years.
Okay. In 3 to 7 years, if like with a leveraged buyout that Mr. Kelso invented, and was the first to employ,
stock ownership
use the capital assets of the corporation to buy the ownership of the corporation for the employees, and he led to the ESOP and that sort of thing. But that is, it doesn't come immediately because the purchase price has to be paid back through a process that is required, and you have a little bit of a lag, let's say 5 to 7 years, before that begins to start throwing off income by ownership by the masses.
That's right.
And that is a lag that a lot of people can't see. They want it right away, maybe.
You know, they want it right away.
But address that if you could.
Well, again, they want it right away, and the people do have needs right away.
Absolutely.
But people have. I look at it from this point of view. People have 3 kinds of needs in this context. Of course, there are many psychological and personal needs.
Yeah, right.
But somebody comes to your office and says, "Harold, I haven't eaten in a couple of days." Well, you're a very humane person. You feed him.
Yeah.
That's what I call the welfare function. And it's got to be taken care of. If someone hasn't eaten, you need to feed them. And we have people today that need that. They need that today.
They can't sit around 5 years to get a steak or a hamburger.
Now, so that person has a need. Now, there's another person who might come in and say, well, actually, I ate today. My refrigerator has food for the next few days. But I just lost my job. Or my job I have.
My source of income to buy what can be created. From my labor input.
Or I didn't lose my job, but every day I'm getting further in debt because my wages don't pay, so I need a better job.
Yeah.
So that's the labor function. Now the left wing is pretty good at taking care of the welfare. They're trying to take care of the welfare function, and the left wing is focusing on the job function.
Yeah.
And of course, they're in a fight with the right wing, and what the right wing is doing is they're taking care of the rich people's right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital.
And they claim that will lead to growth.
And they think that will trickle down with jobs and welfare
they can trickle down,
for the others.
Yeah.
But I think the left wing ought to be taking not only care of the welfare function, not only care of the labor function, they also should be concerned about enabling poor and working people to acquire capital with the earnings of capital.
And they could, by that way, hoist the capitalists that they have a little affection for on their own petard and bring a real challenge to the capitalist, finance capitalist people who are doing so well and always have since the...
I don't know if they would be hoisted. What they would do is they would expose the hypocrisy of saying only the rich can acquire capital with the earnings of capital.
That's called hoisting.
That is not true.
That might be hoisting them on their own petard. We have why does the progressive community not have an effective challenge to the ownership, plutocratic ownership of a few who benefit so mightily by having that. And I'm sure the few are fine if everybody says, well, we need jobs, or we need to have distribution by need. Mr. Marx said we'll distribute according to need and that kind of thing. And they don't look at the reality and the trends within the reality in a way that can challenge those who are benefiting from it and don't have the vision to create an alternative.
Here is a point in time in which it'd be good to pause and talk about paradigms.
Thank you.
Now, the interesting thing about a paradigm, an example of a paradigm is we used to think that the sun went around the earth.
Right.
And you'd look at the east, and if the horizon was clear, you'd see the sunrise, look to the west, see the sunset. But it was a complete illusion.
It was obvious to everyone, but it was an illusion in terms of a broader reality.
Right. All right. So there's a way of looking at it that way, but it was an illusion.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the interesting thing is that about a paradigm, two things are very interesting about a paradigm.
Spell out what it is, maybe. People don't know. A paradigm is more than just an idea. It's an interrelated
it's a fundamental way
a systems way of seeing ideas.
It's a fundamental way of looking at something.
Okay.
And it comes from the Greek word that means paradigm. That means example.
Uh-huh.
It's an exemplar of thinking.
Right. Uh-huh.
So the paradigm, for example, of seeing capital is increasing labor productivity is a paradigm.
Yeah.
The idea of seeing capital as doing its own work is an alternative paradigm.
That's right.
Seeing the sun going around the earth is a paradigm. Seeing the earth spinning, so it makes the so that's another way. Okay. So but there are two interesting things about paradigms psychologically.
Yeah.
The first one is that it makes you think as though there's no other way of looking at something.
Right, right.
And at the same time, it makes you think as though you're perfectly free to think for yourself.
Uh-huh.
And those are seductive
within
things.
that paradigm.
You think
as
you're
long
free.
as you accept that as broader reality.
Now, here's the point. I made a proposition earlier that the more broadly capital is acquired, the more we will soak up unused capacity profitably and promote growth. That was a proposition I made. The interesting thing is that Adam Smith didn't see that.
No.
Karl Marx didn't see that.
Alfred
Marshall, who brought us what's the neoclassical sort of right-wing ideology of the Republican Party, he didn't see that.
Keynes didn't
see that.
Friedman
John Kenneth Galbraith didn't see that. Milton Friedman didn't see that. So this idea, none of those people saw.
Nor Schumpeter?
Nor Schumpeter. None of those people saw the idea that the more broadly capital is acquired, the more we would promote growth. In fact, they saw it just the opposite. They saw enabling the rich to acquire more capital with the earnings of capital was what would trickle down in terms of jobs and welfare for everybody else. But once you see that capital can be acquired even more profitably if everybody's included, not taking from the rich, but including more people in the process. Once we see that that's the answer to the riddle of why we have unused capacity, then we can empower the poor without taking from the rich.
How do we measure unused capacity? Is that done in a way where if you got a factory that's up and going, you can make automobiles, and then you don't make automobiles, so it's a capacity that's already... How do we measure that? Well, and what's the difference between capacity and collective capability of our total system that's in place, and how do we measure that? We have a way of measuring oil reserves. We get oil reserves, there's a place there where they might be, geologic says, and then they get proven reserves. Then there's different ways of measuring that.
There are many
how do we measure the amount of capacity that is there?
Like many other terms in economics, there are many different meanings of unutilized capacity.
Yeah.
The first, up until John Maynard Keynes, the economic system from Smith and the neoclassical economists assumed that we were at full capacity. And it was only with the Depression. But the problem is we had, before the Great Depression, there were other what we call busts.
Yeah, right.
Where you had a very, what I would call a stingy, static way of looking at unused capacity is simply taking as the numerator, the top of a fraction, the plant, and there's the capital component and the labor component. On the capital component, you take existing plant and equipment that is not being used as the top of the fraction. The bottom of the fraction is total plant and equipment, and that's the capital side.
Right.
And the labor side is simply what they call the unemployment rate. So it's very static. But if your object is to feed and clothe and shelter the world, and you think that's better to take care of people's needs if we have, then there's a much more dynamic way of looking at unutilized capacity, and that is when you focus on the capacity to make more capacity.
Yeah, right.
So one of the ways I teach my students about this, I say, let's assume you were the king or the queen of the world and you wanted to feed and clothe and shelter the world. And would it be easier now than 100 years ago? Well, most people who think about it say, at least technologically, it'd be easier today.
Well, that's what.
And you can do that. You can do that by looking at certain things. Let's think about food. 150 years ago, it took 60% of the people to grow the food.
In this country.
Now it's about 3%.
Yeah, in this
Let's
country.
talk about clothing. 150 years ago, people were spending lots and lots of times making clothing. It takes much relatively with automatic looms and things. Takes many fewer people. Housing, it took a lot of labor power to build housing 150 years ago. So if you just add up the things that it would take to feed, clothe, and shelter the world, we have the capacity. So I say that's one way of looking at unused capacity. But let's look at it more deeply.
Suppose you're more still broadly.
So let's look at the king or the queen of the world today. You're still the king or queen, but just the way the pharaohs loved pyramids, you love unused capacity. So you swing into, let's say, Flint, Michigan, and you see a plant in mothballs because the jobs are over in Korea.
Let's make another mothball plant.
You say, well, that's not enough. I want 5 plants in Flint, Michigan.
That don't do anything.
Each with I just love them. Now it's perverse, but it just that hypothetical example. We could make 5 huge plants in Flint, Michigan today far more easier than 5 plants in 1900 that would have been much smaller. We have the capacity to make more capacity.
Yes.
And there's been no one solved that problem. The left wing hasn't solved. Marx didn't solve that problem. Adam Smith didn't solve that problem. John Maynard Keynes didn't solve that problem.
That's right.
We have more Adam Smith type economics today than we did then. We have more socialist economics today than we did then. We have more Keynesian economics today. We're using all those things. The capacity is growing. What's the simple explanation? The simple explanation, we have unused capacity because we have concentrated ownership, and almost all capital is acquired with the earnings of capital for a stationary base. We don't have mechanisms to broaden ownership, which we could have if we set up a binary economy.
Okay, and we might be able to see the robots coming. We might be able to see massive automation.
We'd welcome them.
We would welcome them, but the people who are going to be displaced in the only way they have to gain income, the masses, is to have a job.
Not necessarily.
And unless there's some welfare
unless you can acquire capital.
Well, no, but I mean, under the current paradigm, the only way you can have it is to get, in order to get food, to feed your wife and your family.
That's all you get today.
And more importantly than that, also to get a sense of dignity and a sense of purpose. That's an identity, one might say. That's a politically meaningful thing. The only way they have to get that is to, you're going to undercut that. That robotic system, much past outsourcing, is going to undercut that in a massive scale, on a world scale, Mr. Keynes said. And then how are they going to get the ability to buy what an automated system is able to produce if they don't have some alternative way to labor? You can't do it through fair wages and through those kind of labor criteria that we've done through history, but they got to have some alternative way of distributing income, unless, as the socialists might say, let's just do away with private property and distribute everything according to need, totally through the political process, and just do away with all the capital and all the capitalists and so forth. They would say we'll set up according to need, according to the way Mr. Marx said, and it'll be doing away with private property and the whole private sector.
If you think that's a realistic alternative in America today, go ahead. But I'm trying to help poor and working people today, and I don't see a socialist revolution.
No, I was just trying. Do you
happening.
think the progressive community still does have that socialist idea in terms of the motivating factor for what they call, and what Mr. Obama's talking about is along those lines?
I don't know whether I can't speak for Obama. I'm not an expert on Obama. I wouldn't want to characterize him.
No, I'm talking about the thing.
But I would like to do. What I would like to do is to say that the notion that labor and welfare are the only ways to enable people to participate in production is self-defeating if you want to liberate people.
Yeah.
If you want to liberate people, then you need to be able to own. And dignity can come from owning as well as it comes from jobs and welfare.
Or it could also come, if I may, it all could come, if people could, that could be a way toward encouraging leisure that would allow people to be involved in the life of the mind and the spirit and the things that really are important, rather than being a wage slave within a system that's all owned by people who set the template for everybody else like serfs on a feudal estate. It could be the way toward a renaissance of the human spirit with the things that really matter within the realm of love and so forth, the major important values that are liberating of the whole human spirit, perhaps.
I think property helps liberate people.
Okay.
The only people that I know of who are free are the people who earn not only from their labor, but people who own from their capital. I think capital is what has liberated people from the time we were at the Stone Age.
Yeah, the technology.
Technology, is, I think, is very liberating. The socialist systems that have been tried have not produced huge amounts of abundance. Maybe they will. Maybe there's another way. But you have to also understand that I am here to simply teach people that there is a way of achieving growth and autonomy through the private property system if we let everybody play the game.
Yeah, right. If we could set that up as,
right.
an alternative.
It doesn't have to be the only alternative.
No.
But right now it's not discussed as an alternative. Now I think the sad thing is that both the left and the right wing have together worked against communicating this idea to poor and working people.
Well, we're going to
the right wing it squelches this idea, and so does the left wing. And it's important now, if for those of us who are interested in helping poor and working people, to recognize that they have a right to know about this idea as well.
And it might be the basis by which they could get again, I think the traditional critique of things, and there's a lot of that in the air now, are not adequate to what the future requires in the system. And it may be that they get an idea that is going to give political support to real changes that would make these things possible. And it's going to come out of the thinking of people like, I would say, Louis Kelso and yourself and the others that are involved in that kind of way of thinking, new thinking, which is called for. And how are we going to communicate that? One way we're going to try is through public access television. And this has been great to be able to welcome you once again on the program and to link you up with some of the others and to try and see if we can't get some of these perceptions into the realm where it can be picked up by greater numbers of people. Thanks, Bob, for all your work, and thanks for coming in today for the program. Great pleasure for you and the audience to have the perceptions of Robert Ashford, major voice of binary economics and a view of the organization, economic and political organization of the society. Thank you for viewing. We invite you to tune in. We'll come back again tomorrow. One more time, Bob, thanks a lot for all your good work and your such well-led life. Please tune in tomorrow. We'll be coming back then. Thank you. So I think we should run the credits, I think. And then, so that was, it's a big subject. It's hard to get around everything, you know. We should have got, it would be good if we could get some of those charts. I'm sorry we're so limited here. Well, when you come back,
I will put some on the air and on the web so that you'll be able to use all my charts.
That will be good. It would be good because the web is a thing that's bringing together people and the youth, and then multimedia also with the television and everything. So we're doing our best. So Happy New Year 2008. Happy New Year to you. Maybe this is the year that it'll start coming into good order, right?
I hope so. It would be good.
Okay.